When were you born?
A few decades ago. That's all I'm going to say.
Alright. What does the Cold War mean to you?
It means a nuclear war of superpowers, United States and Soviet Union.
When you were a child, did you hear people talking about nuclear weapons? How were the general feeling about these weapons?
I remember the mention of it on TV and in the news, but it was always very distant to me as I was a child at the time and not in North America. However, I always felt it wouldn't happen as both sides couldn't be that crazy to exchange nuclear bombs and target civilians.
Did you understand who the enemy was? How was the enemy typically portrayed in your society?
Well, during my childhood, it was always the Soviet Union of Russia that was portrayed as the enemy and trying to destroy capitalism and turn the whole world communist.
Did your school have air raid drills during this era? What were some of the procedures?
No, as my childhood was in Persia or Iran and India. There was no fear of Cold War in those countries. At least, I never felt that way.
When you were younger, did you ever hear about or see a bomb shelter? What supplies did people put in bomb shelters? Why? What feelings did you have about these bomb shelters?
Yes, I did see bomb shelters. In fact, so did my children as toddlers. But it was of a different kind and not for a nuclear threat. It was in Israel when there was fear of Saddam Hussein of Iraq bombing. Every building had a bomb shelter, so anyone from even a street could take shelter. But also each apartment had a designated room as a bomb shelter room, so we could take shelter with all the glass windows taped to avoid broken glass flying everywhere and well sealed, so if there is a nerve gas, it would not easily get to us. We also had special masks and even a syringe to use as an antidote for a nerve gas. The shelters were not designed for nuclear weapons.
Were you ever afraid of nuclear weapons?
No, as I was not threatened by it where I lived. However, even the thought of it for any other population is devastating for me. When I think about the previous wars and what happened in Hiroshima, my heart feels crushed.
Describe someone you admired during the Cold War period.
President Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. They championed putting an end to the Cold War crisis between the two superpowers.
What do you remember watching on television or hearing on the radio?
Just bombs and how the Soviet Union were advancing in technology with limited understanding as I was quite young.
What was the first time you remember hearing about the Soviet Union or USSR and its conflicts with the United States?
I know it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1960s, although it was before my time. I remember references made to it later in my life.
What books did you read or movies did you watch that villainized the Soviet Union or dealt with the Cold War? How did they shape your impressions at the time?
I did not read any books, but saw numerous movies that always villainized the Soviet Union. So as a child, I used to think that Soviet spies were everywhere and trying to sow the seeds of communism. That was when I was a kid and impressionable.
What were you taught in school and at home about the Soviet Union? What did your school and family teach about nuclear threats and nuclear war?
We were taught that Soviet Union is a villain country that wants to pervade Iran by promoting communism and changing the people's minds and ideologies. Other than that, I do not recall any concerns about nuclear threats or nuclear wars. Iran was not a match to fight with nuclear technology. Likewise, India is another country I lived in during my childhood.
Were you or any of your family members ever afraid that there would be a hot war or nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union? When did you feel that way?
None at all. We were never afraid, as during my childhood we lived in a country that was not at war or threat of war with Russia or US. However, I remember there was always concerns that the Soviet Union would want to turn Iran into a communist country. We never thought there would be a war, but rather change in the state of mind of people and wanting to start a revolution.
What aspects of the space race do you remember? What did it mean to you?
I remember they were always in competition with each other in terms of their space programs, unlike these days when you actually see collaboration and exchange of information. Although it happened before my time, I remember reading about how Russia was ahead of the States in space race and had the first orbiting satellite in space and the giant booster rockets. But then again, I remember reading about United States astronauts of Apollo 8 were circulating the moon in 1969 for the first time. I believe these competitions were for the better and not for worse, as there were advancements in space technologies.
How was the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union promoted in sports? Can you think of any specific examples?
I remember each country always focused on training their athletes for the competition to get more medals, and were always trying to recruit athletes into their countries to get more competitive in sports. I remember it was very easy to immigrate to US if you were an athlete. Nadia Comaneci, among other athletes, was one that was accepted into US with open arms because she was defecting from Russia and was the first ever gymnast who could get a perfect 10 for marks during world championships.
How do you think future generations will remember the Cold War?
Just a childish game of superpowers, as there is no victory when everyone is dead. That US President Ronald Reagan and the President of the Soviet Union Mikhail Gorbachev were the heroes of their time and championed something that the other presidents could not do: end the Cold War.
How does psychological warfare today compare to psychological warfare during the Cold War?
I believe the psychological warfares during the Cold War were much more real, as it was us against them, whereas now it is more like one president against another leader. It's not people in one country against people in another country. It is more a political war rather than a war of nuclear powers or weapons. People would have a hard time imagining that a leader would want to annihilate or wipe out an entire country. As Ronald Reagan once said, Cold War can never be won.
Do you have any recollections of the end of the Cold War?
My recollection is a picture of Ronald Reagan, President of United States, and Mikhail Gorbachev, President of Soviet Union, in Times magazine in 1988, taken in Washington with a capture, "I did not imagine to be here."
What lessons should students today take away from the Cold War?
That Cold War could never be won and therefore should never be fought. That we need to focus on peace rather than war.
Do you think world peace is possible, or will there be a Cold War?
I believe a time will come when we realize that world peace is not only possible, but it is the next stage in the history of human evolution.
How can we work towards achieving world peace if we think it would be possible?
I believe the best vehicle we have to work towards achieving world peace is the United Nations. working through the leaders of various nations and non-government organizations. Also, most importantly, through people, one heart at a time. Whether we have peace through a consultative act or through unimaginable horrors of war is a choice before humanity.
Thank you very much for everything.
My pleasure.
Really appreciative.
My pleasure.
Alright. See you next time, everybody, on the news.